Hello. Sorry you weren't in class today. Hope AP exams went well if that's where you were. Please watch this video before class on Friday. So what we do on Friday is directly related to this. So if you show up Friday without learning this, then Friday is not going to make a lot of sense for you. Okay? So we're starting our last unit of the year, and today's lesson is on circles, writing equations for circles. Before we get to that, we want to review the process for completing the square, which was one method of solving a quadratic equation that we did back first semester. Around the same time we did quadratic formula, factoring, all that. So let's quickly review completing the square. So I've got it broken down by steps here. So if you've got this quadratic equation, set equal to 0. So the first step is to move C. C is the constant at the end there. Move C so it's alone if necessary. So in this case, I want to move the -2. So add 2 to both sides. X squared minus 6x equals 2. That's step 1. Step 2, find half of the b value and then square that. Add this number to both sides of the equation. Okay, so the b value is the coefficient of the x to the first term there. So in this case, the b value is -6. So we take half of -6 and then square that. So that would be -3 squared, which is 9. So add that number to both sides of the equation. Plus 9, plus 9. Okay, then step 3 says to simplify. So what we created here is called a perfect square trinomial. And that always factors. And your 2 factors are going to be the same factor. That's why it's called a perfect square. And if you remember the shortcut, just take half of this b value. So half of -6 is -3. So x squared minus 6x plus 9 factors into x minus 3 times x minus 3, which can be written as x minus 3 squared. Okay, and then 9 plus 2 is 11. So that's what I mean by simplify. Step 4, solve for x using square roots. So we would take the square root of both sides of the equation. So the square root cancels with the square there. We just have x minus 3. And then remember, when you take the square root of both sides of an equation, there are 2 roots there. So plus or minus the square root of 11. Then we're solving for x, so we add 3 to both sides. So final answer, x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 11. If you can simplify the square root, go ahead and do that, but we're not looking for any decimal answers here, so 3 plus or minus square root of 11. Okay. Example 2. So there's an extra step here. So example 1, the leading coefficient was 1, was 1x squared. Here we have 4x squared. So there's an extra step involving some factoring. Step 1 is the same, so we're going to move that 5 to the other side. So then I would have 4x squared minus 8x equals -5. So the extra step between step 1 and step 2 is step 1.5. factor out the leading coefficient if it's not equal to 1. So here we're factoring out 4. Factoring, so I got 4 times x squared minus 2x. Leave a space there. Equals -5. If I do the distributive property, I should get back what I started with. Okay, so take half of the new b value. So I'm going to take half of -2 and square that. Half -2 is -1. -1 squared is 1. Okay, so 1 goes there. And then maybe you remember as far as what to add to the other side. So technically we didn't add 1 to the left side of the equation. We added 1 times 4 because everything inside the parentheses is being multiplied by this 4. So I really added 4 on the left side of the equation here. If I multiplied this out, I would have 4 here, which I didn't have before. So on the right side, I need to add 4. That's 4 times 1. Okay, so then this factors half of the b value, -1, and -5 plus 4 is -1. Then we're solving for x. So divide by 4. And take the square root. So x minus 1 equals plus or minus. Square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 4 is 2. And then this is negative, so the square root of a negative number is imaginary. So yeah, plus or minus 1/2 I. Okay, and then add 1. So get your final answer. So x equals 1 plus or minus 1/2 I. Okay, so that's completing the square. So we will be using a portion of this process today with circles. Next Friday we're doing something called ellipses. Next Tuesday we're doing hyperbolas. So all of this will involve this completing the square process. Okay, so here's a little extra practice. If you want to hit pause and give these a try on your own first. So what do you fill in the blank there so that these factor, so these are perfect square trinomials that factor. So you're taking half of the b value, squaring it, that's what goes in the blank there, and then writing it in factored form. So go ahead and put pause and give those a try. Okay, so half of 4 is 2, 2 squared is 4. And then half of b is +2, so this would be x plus 2 squared. So whatever symbol you got with the x here, plus or minus, that's what you're going to have here. Half of -12, -6. -6 squared is 36. Factors into x minus 6 squared. Half of 2 is 1, 1 squared is 1. And half of b is also 1, so x plus 1 squared. The last one here does get into some fractions. And I strongly recommend fractions over decimals, especially when you get into like the rest of the problems here. Stick with fractions. Okay, so half of -1 is -1/2. Square that, you get +1/4. And then when we factor that, that's half of b, so that's negative 1/2. So this would factor into x minus 1/2 squared. Okay, so we'll be doing this a lot when we talk about circles and everything else. So this is the standard form equation for a circle. X minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. When it's in that form, the center of the circle are the numbers h and k, and the radius of the circle is r. Not r squared. In the equation, it's r squared, so we would take the square root to figure out the radius. Okay, so our goal is going to be to take an equation like this. So believe it or not, this is an equation for a circle. So we want to rewrite this so it looks like this. Because when it's in standard form, this is standard form. When it's in standard form, you can just look at it and say, okay, the center is h and k, and the radius is the square root of r squared. When it's in this form, you have like no idea what the center and the radius, that's the follow-up question there. Okay, so the goal is to make this equation look like that. Okay, so step one, make the leading coefficient 1. And I'm going to abbreviate leading coefficient LC. Make leading coefficient 1 by dividing every term by the leading coefficient. Okay, so the leading coefficient here is 4. I wrote diving. Let's try that again. Don't dive every term by the leading coefficient. Dividing every term by the leading coefficient. That looks better. Okay, so let's rewrite our equation out here. 4x squared plus 4y squared minus 24x plus 16y equals negative 51. Okay, so divide everything by 4. Everything on both sides of the equation. Okay. So then 4x squared over 4 just becomes x squared. Same thing with y squared. Negative 24 over 4, negative 6x. 16 over 4 is 4y. And then 4 does not go evenly into negative 51, so we're just going to leave that as negative 51 fourths. Okay. Step 2, we're going to do a little rearranging of the terms. Rearrange the terms. So the x terms are together. And the y terms are together. And after you do a few of these, you'll probably start to do step 1 and 2 at the same time. I just want to show you what that looks like. So we're just rearranging this so the x terms are together. So I would have x squared minus 6x. And then after that, why don't you leave a space? y terms together, y squared plus 4y, need a space, equals negative 51 over 4. Okay, and then you can probably guess the next step. We want to turn these into perfect square trinomials, so that then when we factor it, we get something like this, x minus h squared, y minus k squared. Okay, so step 3, find 1/2 of b, square that for both x and y. Oops. For both x and y. And then you want to add that number to both sides of the equation. Add to both sides of the equation. Okay, so just like we were doing before, half of -6, -3, -3 squared is 9. Add 9 to both sides of the equation. Half of 4 is 2, 2 squared is 4. Add 4 to both sides of the equation. Okay, and then we simplify. So this would be half of b, x minus 3 squared. Half of b, y plus 2 squared. So 9 plus 4 is 13. And if I get a common denominator, that would be 52/4. So this is 52/4. If I add that to negative 51/4, then I'm left with positive 1/4. And at the end here, r squared should always be positive. If somehow you end up with something negative over there, then go back and check your work because you made a mistake somewhere. Okay, so we got positive 1/4 for r squared. All right, so there's our equation in standard form. X minus h squared, y minus k squared equals r squared. Then it said name the center and the radius. Okay, so the center of the circle, h is 3. X minus h is 3. Excuse me. Okay, and then what are we subtracting here? It's y plus 2, which is the same as y minus negative 2, right? So we're actually subtracting negative 2 there, so k is negative 2. So the center of the circle is 3, negative 2. And the radius, so again in the equation, the right side of the equation is equal to r squared. So we would take the square root of this number. So square root of 1 is 1, square root of 4 is 2. So the radius would be 1/2. Okay. So there's one more example here. If you'd like to hit pause, try that on your own, see how it goes, and then turn this back on and check and see how you did. Probably would be a good idea. Okay, let's see how you did here. So we're dividing everything by 2. So our leading coefficient becomes 1. So that's going to become x squared. And then if you want to do the rearranging at the same time, so I've got minus 2x y squared plus 6y. And 18 over 2 is 9. Okay, half of the b values, square it, would be -1 squared is 1. Add 1 to both sides. Half 6 is 3, 3 squared is 9, add 9 to both sides. X minus 1 squared, y plus 3 squared. And we'll get 10 plus 9 is 19. Okay, then identify the center and the radius. Maybe you figured out the coordinates of the center opposite of the signs that you have here. So it'd be +1 and -3. And the radius is the square root of 19. Which cannot be simplified, so we'll just leave it as the square root of 19. Okay, so I hope all that made sense. Give worksheet 24, I believe it is. Whatever was attached to the email, that's the homework, that worksheet. Hopefully you got that done, bring that back Friday, and then you will not be behind, ready to dive into ellipses. Have a good rest of your day, evening, whenever you're watching this, and we'll see you in class hopefully on Friday.